clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading it loud and clear.
Roger roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, there,
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the February 27, 2019 edition of Space News. This is Peter Aylward, and I have Tina Stagg and Michael Abdill here from the Space Association of Australia. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We'll start this week with more news from Australia. I love saying that. SAA Deutschland and Southern Launch have partnered to utilise SAA's software capabilities for Australia's future Whalers Way Orbital Launch Complex Mission Control Centre. The Whalers Way Orbital Launch Complex is under development by Southern Launch along the southern coastline of South Australia. The complex is dedicated to the launch of small lift vehicles to polar and sun-synchronous orbits and is being designed to launch rockets between 9 and 29 metres tall with a payload capacity of 50 to 400 kilograms. Southern Launch will also develop and market SAA's ground segment, mission control and other related software capabilities and offerings to the broader Australian market as part of the teaming agreement. This agreement is the start of a long-term relationship with the broader Australian space ecosystem, said Uli Leibniz, Director of Space SAA Deutschland. Southern Launch is yet to conduct a demonstration launch, however their website promises that will happen as soon as possible. Tina.
Thanks, Peter, and good evening, space fans. In US space policy news, with President Trump formally approving a proposal to create a Space Force, now comes the hard part, getting Congress on board. Space Policy Directive 4, which Trump signed at an Oval Office ceremony on Tuesday, directs the Pentagon to develop a legislative proposal for a Space Force within the Department of the Air Force. That proposal will be delivered to Congress in the coming weeks. Supporters of the Space Force note that the concept is similar to one that won bipartisan approval in a House Defence Authorization Bill 2 years ago, making it more likely to pass than original plans to have a Space Force as a separate department of the armed forces. In NASA news, NASA received $21.5 billion in the fiscal year 2019 spending bill signed into law last week. The bill, which averted another partial government shutdown, contained the same funding and report language for the agency as one the House passed last month, including criticism of James Webb Space Telescope cost overruns and schedule delays. The $21.5 billion was $1.6 billion above the agency's original request, with NASA's science programs getting $1 billion more. The bill also restores funding for educational programs the administration had sought to cancel. NASA's fiscal year 2020 budget request is expected to be released early next month. NASA has redesignated its Independent Verification and Validation Facility in Fairmont, West Virginia, as the Katherine Johnson Independent Verification and Validation Facility in honour of the West Virginia native and NASA hidden figure. I'm thrilled we are honouring Katherine Johnson in this way, as she is a true American icon who overcame incredible obstacles and inspired so many, said NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. President Donald Trump signed into law in December an act of Congress calling for the redesignation. V&V is now in the process of planning a rededication ceremony. Johnson and fellow African-American mathematicians Dorothy Vaughan and Mary Jackson broke through racial barriers to achieve success in their careers at NASA. Their story became the basis of the 2017 film Hidden Figures. In NASA commercial crew news, NASA has given the go-ahead for SpaceX's commercial crew test flight. NASA managers have given their approval for SpaceX to proceed with an uncrewed test flight of its Crew Dragon spacecraft on March 2. At the conclusion of a day-long flight readiness review at the Kennedy Space Center, NASA announced it approved plans for SpaceX to fly mission-designated Demo 1, featuring its Crew Dragon spacecraft, but without astronauts on board, to the International Space Station. The review featured more than 100 people from NASA and SpaceX, examining the readiness of both the spacecraft and the station to support the mission. The current schedule calls for a launch at 6:48 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time on March 2 in an instantaneous launch window. The Falcon 9 will lift off from Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center and will put the Crew Dragon into orbit. The spacecraft is scheduled to dock with the ISS one day later and remain there until March 8, when it will undock and splash down several hours later in the Atlantic Ocean. Should the launch be delayed for any reason, there are backup launch dates on March 5 and either March 8 or 9. Demo 1 will be followed by a crewed test flight carrying NASA astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, scheduled for no earlier than July, a schedule that will depend on what work will be needed to respond to issues discovered during the Demo 1 test. An in-flight abort test of the Crew Dragon spacecraft will take place between Demo 1 and Demo 2. That mission is scheduled for June, according to a NASA schedule released in early February, but SpaceX CEO Elon Musk said on Twitter during the week that the mission could take place in April, using the same Falcon 9 first stage that just launched the new Santara Satu communications satellite and 2 secondary payloads. In UK space news, an experimental satellite successfully tested a harpoon as a means of capturing space debris. The removed debris satellite, developed by the University of Surrey, fired the harpoon at a target held at the end of a long boom. The harpoon hit the target and captured it in its barbs. The satellite, launched last year, was built to test debris capture technologies, including an earlier demonstration of a net. The spacecraft will later deploy a sail to increase its drag and accelerate its re-entry.
Thanks, Tina. Let's move on to NASA Planetary and Space Science. As NASA selects payloads it would like to fly on commercial lunar landers this year, companies are sceptical of the timeline. NASA announced last week it has chosen a dozen scientific instruments and technology demonstrations from within the agency it plans to fly on commercial landers, with the first such flight taking place as soon as late this year. NASA officials said they were willing to provide financial incentives to companies that are able to fly this year. However, executives with 2 of the companies that have NASA contracts for those missions, Astrobotic and Moon Express, said they didn't expect their landers to be ready until 2020 or 2021, and didn't think any of the other providers would be able to fly this year either. Okay, moving on to the US Air Force. SpaceX and United Launch Alliance split 6 launch contracts awarded by the Air Force last week. SpaceX will receive $297 million to launch AFS PC-44, NROL 85 and NROL 87. ULA will receive $441.76 million under a fixed price contract to launch SBIRS GEO-5, SBIRS GEO-6 and Silent Barker, a classified space situational awareness mission. The launches are scheduled for fiscal year 2021, with the SBIRS GEO-6 contract an option for launch in 2022.
All right, we're moving over to Russia now. Roscosmos will work with Space Adventures to fly more tourists. Roscosmos said last week it signed a contract with the US company to fly 2 tourists on Soyuz missions to the ISS by the end of 2021. The announcement didn't disclose the price that will be charged to the customers or other details about the flight. Space Adventures regularly flew tourists to the ISS on past Soyuz missions, but the last such mission was nearly a decade ago. Singer Sarah Brightman was to fly to the station in 2015, but backed out for personal reasons. And still in Russia, Russian President Vladimir Putin has called for the creation of a national space centre. In a State of the Nation address last week, Putin called on the government and state space corporation Roscosmos to establish the centre that would unite various organisations involved in Russian space activities. The centre, to be based at the Khrushchev facility, will host 20,000 people and begin operations in 3.5 years. Michael.
Okay, let's look at Japan. Japan's Hayabusa 2 spacecraft made a successful touch-and-go landing on the asteroid Ryugu last week. Telemetry from the spacecraft indicated that it touched down on the asteroid and fired a projectile into the asteroid to pick up dust and rocks to collect before ascending. Project officials said they won't know how much material Hayabusa 2 collected until the spacecraft returns to Earth, but said the spacecraft performed as expected. 2 more sample collection efforts are planned before Hayabusa 2 departs the asteroid, returning to Earth in late 2020. Peter.
Okay, let's swing over to SpaceX. A SpaceX Falcon 9 successfully launched a communications satellite and a lunar lander late last week. The Falcon 9 lifted off on schedule from Cape Canaveral in Florida with its primary payload, the Nusantara Sutu communications satellite for Indonesia operator Pacific Satellite Nusantara. That satellite, along with an experimental Air Force Research Lab smallsat called S5, separated from the rocket's upper stage about 45 minutes after liftoff. Bereshit, the lunar lander developed by Israeli organisation Space IL, separated from the upper stage earlier and is on track to attempt a lunar landing in April. The Falcon 9's first stage, making its third launch, successfully landed on the drone ship despite what SpaceX said were challenging conditions. Elon Musk said after the launch that the stage would fly again in April to perform an in-flight abort test for the company's Crew Dragon spacecraft. I think the booster will be destroyed in that test. And Virgin Galactic conducted its fifth powered test flight and second spaceflight of its commercial Spaceship Two, VSS Unity, last week. In its fifth supersonic rocket-powered test flight, Virgin Galactic reached space for the second time in the skies above Mojave, California. Spaceship VSS Unity reached its highest speed and altitude to date, and for the first time carried a third crew member on board along with research payloads from NASA Flight Opportunities Program. This spaceflight means Chief Pilot Dave McKay and co-pilot Michael Mascucci become commercial astronauts and the 569th and 570th humans in space. Beth Moses, Virgin Galactic's chief astronaut instructor, flew as the third crew member in the first live evaluation of cabin dynamics. She is the 571st person to fly into space and the first woman to fly on board a commercial spaceship. In addition, VSS Unity flew higher and faster than ever before, as its world record-holding hybrid rocket motor propelled the spaceship at Mach 3.04 to an apogee of 295,007 feet, which is 55.87 miles or 89.9 kilometres. The flight notched several additional firsts for the industry. The flight was the first time that a non-pilot flew on board a commercial spaceship to space. It's the first time that a crew member floated freely without restraints in weightlessness in space aboard a commercial spaceship. It was the first time that 3 people flew to space on a commercial spaceship, and Dave McKay became the first Scottish-born astronaut. Well, there you go. Mike.
Space Florida announced a deal with Firefly Aerospace last week. The agreement covers a manufacturing facility in Exploration Park just outside the gates of the Kennedy Space Center and access to Launch Complex 20. Firefly is developing the Alpha small launch vehicle at its Texas headquarters, with a first launch planned from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California late this year.
All right, and finally this week we have former NASA astronaut Mark Kelly announcing plans to run for the US Senate. Kelly said recently he would run in the 2020 election for the Senate seat in Arizona, currently held by Republican Senator Martha McSally. Senator John McCain was re-elected to the seat in 2016 but passed away last August, and McSally was appointed at the end of last year to hold the seat through to the 2020 special election. Kelly is seen as a frontrunner for the Democratic nomination. Kelly flew on 4 space shuttle missions before retiring from NASA in 2011 and is married to the former Representative Gabrielle Giffords, who was the victim of a gunshot wound, people may recall. Anyway, good luck, Mark. And that's it for our space news this week. Thank you, Tina and Michael, and it's Andrew.